Today we have Dr. Arezoo, Malihi and Annie Chiang to speak with us about refugees resettlement trajectories in New Zealand. Arezoo is a research fellow at the Centre for Asian Pacific Studies. She has a PhD in population health with a background in nutrition and epidemiology and now works as an interdisciplinary researcher. Annie is a PhD candidate in epidemiology and biostatistics within the School of Population Health. She uses a mixed methods approach to look at missing data in New Zealand's routinely collected data sets. Both Arezoo and Annie are experienced users of the integrated data infrastructure and have used this data for their presentation today, which will be really interesting. So thanks both. I'll pass on to you now.
Thank you so much, Steph. I'm going to start and then I'll pass on to Annie midway and then I'll be back. So that's how we are going to present this data today. That's a great opportunity. Thanks for this opportunity to present this data to you all. It's been about 1.5 years, nearly 2 years that we've been working on this data. And it's really important that we have audience here being here with us to present the data. So I just quickly go through the acknowledgement and disclaimer for IDI. So this data is solely ours. So we take full responsibility for this any data presented in these slides, and it's not official stats, and so no responsibility for stats in New Zealand. So as Steph mentioned, we used IDI. IDI is integrated data infrastructure. That's a large database that holds the identified microdata about people and households, about births, deaths, marriages, census data, visa applications, border movements, education, housing, health, and everything else. So there is a spine where anyone who ever accessed immigration or had data with IRD or had birth registered in New Zealand, they are in that spine. And that's how other administrative data can be connected to each other through the spine. So if someone is not in a spine, we can connect their education data, for example, with health data. So that provided us with an excellent opportunity to understand the trajectories of resettlement for refugees in New Zealand. And having said that, I just want to tell you that there are 3 main refugee subgroups. The majority of refugees come as quota refugees, and quotas are those who are referred by United Nations and are becoming residents once they arrive in New Zealand. So they have all the rights that residents have in New Zealand. Then the second group are family support category. So all of the refugees resettled in New Zealand, they can sponsor a family member to come to New Zealand. The next group, and so this is just based on they sponsoring them to come to New Zealand. It's not related to United Nations. Then convention refugees are those asylum seekers within the country who are applying for asylum. And then, so they are in the country from a few months to a few years. They can stay and like under different visas, short-term visas, until a decision is made on their case. And then once the decision is positive, they become convention refugees. And from that point, they get a lot of services and access to services, rights to use services such as education, and health, and etc. Then the fourth group is asylum seekers. In our group, actually, asylum seekers are not refugees. They're unsuccessful applicants who couldn't get convention refugee. One of the main reasons why we wanted to look into data for all of these different subgroups is that most of the information available is about quota refugees, and it's not much information about other groups of refugees and non-unsuccessful refugees, because it turns out that many asylum seekers stay in the country for quite a few years to get to some point, and once unsuccessful, it takes some time before they're deported or before they're leaving the country. So it was interesting to understand what happens to them and how much they are accessing services, because that should have been a really stressful time for them. So this is a flowchart of how we found refugees. We accessed decision tables within immigration database from there, we identified about 38,000 people within that table with refugee or asylum in their decision table in the criteria or substream variables. From there, we got to the point where we didn't find any information in this spine for 2,500 people. So they were dropped. And then for those people who arrived, so all refugees. So the information was available from 1997 to 2020. Actually, we chose 2020 to be the last year. For those people who arrived before 2020, if they didn't stay in the country for at least 1 year, we dropped them. We wanted to look into long-term outcomes. And then we looked into those people who arrived in the country as adults, aged between 16 to 50, 16 to 65. And that finally led us to about 25,000 people. Most of them are quota refugees, as I said. This is the largest proportion of refugees in the country. 11,000, 2,500 are family refugees, and convention refugees, about 5,400 people. Then we have non-refugees, about 6,096. This I'll talk to you about a little bit about these asylum subgroups, because there are kind of like two subgroups of asylums in the country. So there are substantial differences in terms of demographics of these people. Just long story short, they are all young people. Highest proportions are between 16 to 40. The differences between asylum convention and family quota, the two categories, is like for asylum and conventions, there are higher proportions of 30 to 40 age at arrival. For family and quota, there are high proportions of age 16 to 30. And then for family, this is the highest proportion of people aged 50 and above arriving in the country as refugees, as family refugees, which is substantially higher than other subgroups for that age group. There is a significant difference in gender too, as asylum and conventions are almost twice as more males than females, as you can see here. But for family and quota refugees, the proportions of female and male are almost the same. So now I just wanted to mention why I mentioned asylum seekers can stay in the country for quite a few years, because it takes so much time, could take so much time for a decision to be made on their case. And so during the time, from year to year, they have to apply and reapply for short-term visas, could be a work visa or any kind of interim visa, so that the immigration has time to collect information about their case and make a decision. I looked into this information for those quota refugees for whom I had information about the date that they sought asylum. And for those people who arrived before 2012, it looked like there were higher proportions of people for whom a decision was made under 1 year, as compared to those people who arrived on and after 2012. And as you can see, it could take even to 36 months and over 36 months for people for decision being made. And that's like between 10 to 15% of people. It's not a substantial number of people who might be run in the country without any decision and without any future, any sight of the future, what is happening to them. And that explains asylum seekers, unsuccessful conventions. The asylum seekers who've been in the country for quite some time. Some of them, like about 2,200 of these 6,000 people, they got residency through other categories, like relationship, like family, other categories not related to refugee. And the other ones, they above 3,500 people, they had to leave country at some point, but they stayed in the country for at least 3 to 4 years. Now I just pass on to Annie to hear about what she's done with mobility data and with deprivation of refugees, and then I'll be back with you with some information about the income of refugees.
Thanks, Arezoo. So my name's Annie, and as Stephanie mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Population Health. So I came on board to help Arezoo sort of build this cohort, and also we're kind of, Arezoo allowed me to sort of take a tangent on this project to look at where our refugee and asylum seekers were living and sort of what areas they were sort of settling in. As we know, the area that you're settling in often has sort of associated levels of access to different resources, different sort of levels of crime or housing availability. So that's essentially what we're trying to capture with the NZIMD, the Index of Multiple Deprivation. So as you can see on screen, the IMD sort of captures lots of different domains that measure sort of socioeconomic status. So this one, we've decided to use the 2013 edition just because it sits in the middle of sort of the cohort that we're trying to capture. The 2018 was available at the time we started the project, but just based on advice from Dan Exeter, we decided to go with this one. So for those of you that don't know or aren't familiar with the IMD, perhaps you're familiar with the NZDEP. It's kind of a similar type of area-based measure, but the NZIMD kind of takes not only census information, but it also takes information from IID, education, lots of different sort of data sets available in the IDI to create this metric, ranking sort of the different data zones or neighbourhoods in New Zealand from the most deprived to the least deprived. So most deprived, you could sort of, it's synonymous with the idea of being in the most hardship or having the least access to sort of good determinants of socioeconomic status. Whereas the least deprived, you would say the most affluent areas or most affluent neighbourhoods. So let me see if you flip over to the next slide. So what we wanted to do first was we took all the address data that we defined for our cohort and we found their first address. So something worth noting is that with the quota refugees, they often come into the country and they spend a few weeks in Malihi, which is the refugee settlement centre. So we've excluded that first address just to capture the first address that they are residing in, either as an individual or with their family. And so that's what you see in front of you. So what we can see for asylum and convention refugees is that there's a sort of a equal distribution or about the same distribution of them in the mid and high deprivation areas, whereas for family and quota, a much larger proportion of them settling in their first address in a high deprivation area. So next slide. So we also looked at their last address. So we're interested in, where do they start and where do they end up? And you probably notice not much of a difference. And that kind of is suggesting, the first instinct for us is that perhaps where we place or where our refugee and asylum seekers settle first is pretty indicative to where they will end up in terms of the type of neighbourhood that they will go to. So the secondary question, well, if we know that there might be a slight change, we're interested in how often they move, if they do. And you can see that for our conventions, family quota, and even for the asylum, they're generally highly mobile, meaning that they're moving sort of 3 or more times. Some of them can move a lot more than 3, but it just means that they're not sort of staying in the same place. So even though that they are moving, they don't appear to be moving to, I guess, higher socioeconomic areas. And so what we did with this data was not only do we want to know whether or not they're ending up in a high deprivation area, how many times they're moving, we're also interested in sort of how they're moving through the different socioeconomic status areas. And so Jessie Colbert, who's a research assistant for Dan Exeter, produced these Sankey plots for us. So what you can see in the red, that's your higher deprivation area. Orange is your mid sort of deprivation areas and yellow is your low. And so what you can see is on that first bar on the very left, that's their first address, moving to their second address. The grey indicates whether or not, indicates if they've just stayed in the area. That was their last record of, an address. And so if you move along, you can see how they're moving from different areas of different levels of deprivation. So for asylum seekers, you can kind of see that, the majority of them are in mid to low, and that kind of trend sort of persists throughout the different levels of moves. If we go to the next slide. So for convention, the feature I want to draw your attention to is looking at the mid level of deprivation. So as you see, as they're moving through, the majority of them, so we're looking, close to 50% of them, if they are moving, they tend to be moving into the same area, same sort of level of deprivation, so staying in the mid, or if they're going to move out, they're more likely to move out into higher deprivation areas. So it seems like they're moving into, would not normally say worse, but areas that experience a bit more hardship. So the next slide, you'll see the refugee and asylum, the family and quota refugees. They are overwhelmingly being placed in high deprivation areas, or that's where they're settling first, and they are just staying there. They don't seem to be able to move out of those areas or have much success in doing so. And you can see even those who are placed in sort of low deprivation areas in the yellow, that the majority of them are moving out of those areas as well. Very few sort of stay or manage to stay in low deprivation areas through their settlement experience. If we go to the next slide, you can see for quota, the pattern for family and quota generally mirror each other. And then so we had another question. So we've looked at deprivation, we've looked at the number of moves, we've looked at their first and last address. So if we shift our sort of lens to looking at where they're moving to in terms of geography, what you see in front of you is sort of the different regions in New Zealand. And at this scale, we saw very little difference between their first and last address. So what that suggested to us was that there wasn't very much inter-regional movement, that people weren't really moving out of Auckland. So the majority of them are beginning their journey in Auckland and staying there. Again, there was very little difference when we looked at their last address. So we decided at this point, it was better to look at just the Auckland region specifically. And what we also noticed, Arezoo and I noticed, is that because the populations of these groups tend to be quite small, like we only ended up with, around 30,000 people that we could study, that we could either look at their refugee visa status, so refugee, quota, family, asylum, or we could look at their nationality, but we couldn't look at the two together. So one of the questions that arise for us is, if people are moving, where are they moving to, and if they're moving to rejoin sort of the ethnic communities. So this is the Afghani, or the refugee and asylum seekers that come from Afghanistan. So the usually resident population up in the top left-hand corner, that is based on Census 2018. So that's just those who identify themselves as Afghani, total response method. That's kind of how they're distributed. The dark pink is 20% or more. So I guess the majority of the population of Afghani people seem to be outside of Auckland. And then so if we look at where people start their journey, it seems like those who start sort of in sort of the West Auckland, South Auckland, North Auckland region, they seem to either be staying in the north of Auckland, or if they're in West and South, they tend to move out into sort of the northeastern sort of region. It doesn't appear in this plot that the Afghani population or the population from Afghanistan seem to be rejoining with the ethnic Afghani community outside of Auckland. Now if we go to the next slide, which is the Myanmar slide, slide 19. So this is another really large refugee and asylum seeker population for us. So again, it seems like the most of the population that come from Myanmar are residing outside of Auckland, but again, they don't seem to be rejoining with that community if they're a refugee and asylum seeker, and they generally are staying, where they are put, but some of them are sort of moving towards West Auckland as well and spreading kind of more or less evenly throughout the Auckland region, with a big cluster out in that sort of central Auckland area. And then the last group we were able to plot was from Iran. So we're seeing a kind of a different picture. And so what these three different sets of nationalities demonstrate is that each sort of nationality, each group of refugees kind of have a different story and a different pattern of movement. So for those that are beginning their journey in West Auckland or Central Auckland, they seem to be moving out. And for those that, don't move once they arrive, it's because they didn't start in that Central and West Auckland region. And we're seeing with the Iranian population is that they seem to be rejoining or at least moving out of Auckland altogether, which reflects what the Iranian ethnic community in New Zealand have done as well. And I think that's from me. I'll give it back to you, Arezoo.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie. I was to me, I was really interesting part of the study. Thanks for presenting that yourself. So moving into the income data, we can actually move. Yeah. No, first access to housing. So I looked at housing, access to housing, just any access. It's not just how many times people access housing in New Zealand. There's a substantial difference between different refugee subgroups, as you can see here. But I looked at the whole time, the whole period between 1997 to 2020, and then the more recent period. We wanted to compare to see if things are getting better, but it wasn't the case. So about less than 70% of quota refugees have ever accessed housing, New Zealand housing or HNZ. Housing New Zealand, which is and about a little bit more than 20% from family, compared with less than 20% for convention refugees. And for asylums, that's substantially lower than that. Whereas all of these groups are could have access. So they had the right to access housing New Zealand, but that actually reflects the differences in access rates between refugee subgroups. Access to specialist mental health services, and this is from Primed. Primed was collecting data on specialist mental health service access from 2008. So if refugees arrived before 2008 and access services, it's not reflected here. But if they had access after 2008, it is reflected here. As you can see, there's a substantial difference between, again, subgroups of refugees in how much they access these services, and this is just face-to-face services. So if it was a just phone contact, it is not reflected in this figure. They should have been seen services in person, and that includes NGO services as well as DHBs. As you can see, females have approached services more than males, and that is the same with conventional asylum seekers. Just reminding you that conventional asylums were more males, about twice as high males than females in the first place. So that looked like females were more approaching services, whether they needed more or they were freer or they felt less stigma or easier to access these services. We don't know about it. We just see that that is the case. When looking at more serious cases, bed nights, cases that they had to stay overnight, at least for one night, you can see the cases reversed, and males were approaching more than females in most of the subgroups of refugees. And that's really interesting because for asylum seekers, that was females that were approaching more. And that reflects how much they were under pressure, and how much they needed mental health service access. And that is very much underestimation of the need, because like not everyone who feels that they need services, they approach actually these services. And again, I want to bring your attention into differences between different refugee subgroups in terms of access to mental health services. In terms of median income, this is the total income over the years. And on the x-axis, you can see years from arrival. Not every refugee had information about income. We had about 21,000 of refugees out of the about 25,000 have some income information within IRD, and it followed them up from the time of their arrival, first arrival or first decision for convention who were in the country, and then looked them up from there, followed them up from there to see how it is improving. And the income rates are adjusted for inflation. As you can see, in the first 5-6 years, it looks like the total income is increasing. But after that, I don't see much improvements over the years. A little bit, yes, for conventions, quite a lot for asylum seekers, and a little bit for family, but not much for quota refugees, which are the main refugees in the country. So this is total income, adding benefit, income for benefit, wages and salaries, everything, the student income. If you look at the age groups, but age at arrival, it looks like those who arrived at early, like the lower age, the younger they were, they had a better chance of improving over the years in terms of their overall income. When we wanted to compare income of refugees with a sample of population, this representative sample was taken from 2018 and 2019. And to have just a comparison for years, we considered New Zealander NZ-born who were in the country in 1997. Their start date was 1997, if they were 16, or from the time they turned 16 as of their start date. For immigrants, from when they first arrived in the country, that was their start date. And so as you can see, immigrants are the top line here. They were earning more over the years, and then followed by New Zealand-born population. But like refugees are here, and it's their year. I mean, they had some good like catch up at some points. You feel like they are catching up, but not really much. To the gap stayed for the total income of refugees compared with a New Zealand sample of New Zealand population. This is just wages and salaries. So dropping those people who weren't working at all and just keeping those people who were working, about 15,000 of refugees. We are looking at their income and how they improved over the years. So that figure is much better. It's getting to 40 to 50,000 after about 20 years. Which is promising, which is quite better. Sorry. Then we felt like, okay, so let's look at education, because education and income are quite associated. Usually they're going side by side. First of all, we had a lot of missing data for education. Refugees don't come to the country with points as immigration. New Zealand wants points to earn. You should earn those points, and that is dependent to your education, and you should provide immigration with whatever is last education that you hold from your own country. If they've completed something in Ministry of Education, if they answered to questions in census, we had information about them. So we picked up first census answers, and then Ministry of Education, and then Ministry of Social Development for education history. That's how we prioritize getting information about education of refugees. Still, we had a large number of refugees with missing information. But regardless of that missing information, convention refugees were the highest proportions with university, any university degree, bachelor and above. And quota refugees were among had the highest proportions of level 1 to level 4. So it's sort of like a certificate. It's in New Zealand qualification format. So that's kind of a few months of like post-secondary work-related courses could be like L1, could mean L1 to L4. Then we felt like, okay, we have a lot of missing data. So if you want to have another variable that you understand about access to education for refugees, we look into any registration instead of completion. And that was much better. We got quite a good number of quota refugees, whoever access registered Ministry of Education in some courses, something with Ministry of Education. And that was really promising. Still a big gap between different refugee subgroups. Then we looked at income, education, and years from arrivals for males and female refugees. And then, as you can see, this y-axis shows median income of refugees, and you can see these are education of refugees. So no qualification, L1 to L4, L5 to L6, which is a diploma, post-secondary diploma, and then university graduate. As you can see, for the first few years, it seems like university graduation or university degree didn't help refugees to get better income. But from 8 years and above, you could see this difference. That was a little bit better for females, as from 4 to 7 years after arrival, it looked like their education meant something in terms of how much they would earn. But anyway, they were earning around 25,000 a year, their median income. when you look at these figures for immigrants and New Zealand born, it's really interesting because for immigrants, university education is important from the early years, from the first years that are arriving in the country, university, having university degrees, helping them to earn better incomes compared to others with lower levels of education. And for New Zealand born, like having a diploma is the main thing and is helping them to earn more money. And then we looked at conversational English, and that's the variable we picked up from census. So again, those people who responded to census, refugees who responded to census, we could understand better being able to speak English well affected their income. And not too surprising, it did affect income. And yes, quota refugees weren't among those people who were earning much income compared to like convention refugees, but still those who were better in conversational English were earning more than those who weren't. When looking at the top source of income, so the different sources of income you can see from IRD data, the one that they earn highest money for that year, we picked that one up. And then if that was benefits, we looked at the proportions of people whose main source of income was benefit. And as you can see, again, there's a substantial difference between different refugee subgroups in terms of the proportions being on benefit. So quota refugees started at 89, nearly 90%. It dropped substantially, quite fast, like within the first 5-6 years. Didn't improve from there, but that was a substantial difference. The same for family, convention, and asylum seekers. Conventional asylum seekers started from much lower proportions, from about 50% of them having the benefit as their main source of income. Regardless, it dropped quite good, substantially for family and for asylum, convention as well. But it seems like from some time, after 6-7 years, there's not much improvement. So whatever is happening is these figures are showing us that the first 5 to 6 years are really important. If you want to make a change, if you want to do something that makes change in their lives, that's the first 5-6 years. Or perhaps that's because the services are not available after 5-6 years, or are not enough, or not supporting refugees enough. This is main source of income as wages and salaries. Again, this is asylum seekers, this is convention refugees, families, the blue line, and then the black line is quota refugees. Again, in the first 5 years, we can see that the proportions of these subgroups earning their highest income from wages and salaries is increasing. But after some time, it's stagnating in the same place that it's been. And that's just to compare where immigrants and New Zealand born are standing in that way. You can say immigrants' wages and salaries, and this one is NZ born wages and salaries. It's been around between 85 to 95% for immigrants, and between 75% to 85% for New Zealand born. And benefit as the main source of income, it's been between 20%, 15 to 20% for NZ born, and between like nearly 0 to 10% for immigrants. Then we thought, okay, let's look at 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years point, and see how the income range differed between different groups of refugees with immigrants and New Zealand born. So as you can see, after 5 years, still the highest proportions of income for all of the different refugee subgroups are between 10 to 20,000 and 20 to 40,000. Whereas for immigrants and New Zealand born, it's coming to the gray and red and this yellow one. So it's getting to 40 to 60,000 and 20 to 40,000. How about after 10 years? I'm more looking into immigrants again and comparing them with refugees. Here you see it it's improving, but not as much. But at least you are seeing some of these higher bonds, the ones with higher proportions of income between 60,000 to more than 100,000. It's appearing, I mean, more than 100,000 is appearing for at least quota refugee males, convention females and males, and asylum males. I mean, comparing with the immigrants and New Zealand born, obviously, it's still a huge gap, but at least they are catching up. So that's, to some extent, a story of success, but the gap is there. And even after 15 years, the gap is there still, because high proportions of them are still on these bonds stands, $10,000 to $20,000 a year. Then you thought, okay, so what are they working? What is the industries that they've been working in? That could probably explain why they're earning so little money. So the top industries they've been working in, they're accommodations and food services, administrative and support services, agriculture, construction, healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing and retail trade. Then we went back to census because that provided us with more information about the type of jobs, the role that they were taking in each of these industries. So we looked at major jobs, and for immigrants and New Zealand born, the major jobs were professional and managerial role, and then come to technicians and trade workers. For refugees, the major job was laborers, and then coming down to technicians and trade workers, and then community and personal service workers. So to some extent that role within each industry explains that. But we also wanted to see whether there's a discrimination or something beneath what we can see in administrative data. So we weren't talking to people, it was just administrative data and survey data. So within each role that they were taking, how much were refugees earning compared to New Zealand born and immigrants? And as you can see, like for the higher rates of a managerial role, they were earning much lower than New Zealand born immigrants. And for the, but like most managers, if they were refugee managers, they were like among these 10 to 20,000, 10 to 30,000, 40,000 income range. For professionals, income ranges of more than $100,000. Again, it was more for New Zealand born and immigrants and the refugees. And then again, more refugees were falling in these groups, but it was a little bit difficult to understand. So if you're a professional or if you're a manager, it's just so low that you're earning. So maybe that's to do with time and hours working per week. So we looked at hours working per week, and yes, the refugees were working substantially lower hours than the other two groups, and for longer hours of work, 40 to 60 hours, like New Zealand born were working more hours than refugees. So that these differences are substantial. So we thought, okay, so if you want to look at all those factors, so if refugees are working, they are earning better, in a better position in labor market. If we consider staying in jobs for longer periods as an outcome, what is contributing to staying in job for longer, the length of employment? And not to our surprise, we found out that deprivation, high deprivation versus low, and medium deprivation versus low explained lower terms, lower months in unemployment. So where refugees are being resettled, if that's a highly deprived area, they're less likely to stay in a job for longer terms than those who are in lower deprivation areas. And then there was no difference between convention or asylum versus quota refugees, but family refugees were working for longer months than quota refugees. And registering for any course in New Zealand contributed to longer months at work. That was really interesting outcome to us. So in summary, refugee subgroups are substantially different, and that that is to some extent explained by the way that we are receiving refugees. So quota refugees are coming and going in the first 5 weeks. They are going to Mango Refugee Center, where they are receiving a lot of information about how things works in New Zealand. The education, a complete health assessment of them is being done in the first 5 weeks. And then there's someone who is helping them after this 5 weeks to being set up with a GP to understand for the at least first 1 year or 2 years, to understand how things work, like education in New Zealand. It is not the same for convention refugees or family and asylum seekers or non-refugees, so they don't receive any of these anyway. I mean, there are trusts and there are services, if they want to access these services, to provide them with some information, to help them with housing and etc. But if they don't know about this, there's not an orientation program provided for them. So that explains it to some extent. But and then there's a gap. There is a real gap between refugees and the general population, even after 15 years. We are not sure if that's discrimination or anything is playing role in here, but we can guess that could be the case. We can know more about the reasons behind what we are seeing in data if we don't talk to refugees. So the main thing is talking to refugees and doing more studies, surveying refugees and understanding what is working for them. Why is the case that they can't stay in jobs for longer term, they can work for longer hours per week, why they can take on more courses or finish their studies that they start. We need to do surveys to understand more about refugees. And that's where I want to end my presentation today and acknowledge all people who helped me along the way. Definitely Rutherford Discovery Fellowship and Prof. J. Molo, who helped me along the way in the last 2 years with the fellowship that he's got. I've also got AMR fellowship to look into more into details of mental health service access and well-being of refugees within IDI. The whole campus team, they helped me a lot within the last 2 years. And very, very, where I needed him, he was there to provide me with help. And all the data lab team. Jessica Mackley helped with a lot of the statistical questions that I had and models that I'm running. Associate Prof. Dan Exeter and Jesse Colbert for the mobility study, they helped a lot. All the refugee advisory group that we met a few months ago, they provided insightful information. I couldn't get this information reading literature. Immigration New Zealand research analyst team who helped me once I was setting up. Prof. Shole Mauni, economist, who helped me to understand income and employment data. And my friends, Friederike, senior research fellow from Otago University, to help me with understanding prime data, and who helped me with initial identification of refugees and with the SQL work that I was doing, and the whole SATS New Zealand team. Thank you so much. And any questions?
Yeah, so should we start with Ryan, who had a question in the chat?
Because they're mostly parent refugees after 20 years, it's too long to be able to achieve a 50K payment. Okay, I looked at adult refugees only. So this data represents adult refugees. We didn't have any children, no one arriving as a child that we followed up. So that this data is just on those people who were aged 16 to 50 at the time of arrival. Yes, that's right. Yeah, after 20 years, it's too much to achieve a 50K median salary. Yeah, I agree with you. So if we had like children of refugees in our data, it could have been different. So they have literature shows that children are doing much better. Children of refugees who are doing education in New Zealand, they're doing much better. So that could we just wanted to focus on the first generation. But yeah, definitely that's something to consider, and that's some further study to do.
It would be quite interesting to look at, I guess, children of refugees and see how that, that comes through.
Yeah, that was one of the comments that we received from advisory group. Yeah, they were saying that like we know that children are doing much better, and that the first generation has to you know, cope with all of the trauma and the problems. Yeah, and just the settlement of, you know, that's a forced population, forced to leave their own country. They didn't choose to leave their own country. So yeah, definitely for the first generation, that should have been more difficult to integrate.
Okay, Ray, if you've got a question,
Yeah, thanks, Arezoo, for the presentation, and also Annie. I just had a question on data coverage and census. So for education, you mentioned that there is a lot of missing data. I wanted to ask whether if the education field itself was missing, the responses in the census were missing whilst the census coverage was still good, or
there were 15,000 people just attended census, either 2018 or 2013 census. So yes, we had 9,000 people. We didn't have any information.
Yeah.
So non-respondents weren't large within census for those people who responded to census. It was mainly just people who attended or responded to census. Not many refugees did. I mean, considering that some of our refugees, they arrived in 2019 and 2020, that explains. And anyone after March 2018, that explains missing data.
Yeah, so just to follow on the occupation data, then that was out of the people who responded to census only.
For the income rates, I've got income from IRD, not that one, but yes,
but
for roles.
Occupation. Yeah.
Yeah, for roles.
Okay,
yes.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we've got Shanti.
Hi there, guys. I'm sorry, I actually joined late, so about 20 minutes into your presentation, but I'm so glad that you two have presented. So congratulations, Arezoo and Annie. Wonderful presentation, really rich information. I really appreciate the support you've had to do this. My question actually is very much linked to Raya's question, because I heard the part where you're presenting the income data, Arezoo, and you did mention that it was representing people from whom you had IRD data. Do you have any understanding about the selection pressures operating then on the information you're sharing here? I guess I'm particularly thinking of the numbers who are, I think there was about 21,000 people for whom you had that data. So the ones for whom we don't have data, how different do you estimate their realities are going to be compared to the people we do have data on? So I'm just trying to figure out what are the selection biases operating given the access to reasonable quality data that you are referring to.
Yeah, you know, my understanding is that I mean, from what I looked up, I didn't do a study to understand who are those people who didn't do who didn't appear on IRD, to understand how they did, whether they've done they've answered census or not. So I didn't look into that honestly, so I can't compare that. But my understanding is that those people who arrived between 1997 to 2000, many of them left the country. There were many asylum seekers for some reason, I don't know why, within those 3 years, and many of them left the country before we have any data on them, for IRD data or any other census data on them, you know. So for those people, those information is missing.
Yeah. Just might be useful to know that, is that, so that it'll be helpful to interpret who's missing. I think often they're not missing at random, right? We know that. There's usually something going on, and I think it would be really helpful to know what we don't see, and that'll be important for the policy implications. And the other thing is might be a technical one, and you might have mentioned it at the start. I wonder why all the family data stopped partway through.
So families arrived later. So families upstream started later.
Oh,
so it started
right.
from 2003, 2004. Thanks for asking that question, because I didn't mention that in my presentation. Yes, that started late. They started taking the families from 2003. So which means that I had data for those early arrivals. I had data for 16 years only, and if the numbers were less than 20, I couldn't. It was suppressed. Data was suppressed. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you for attending.
Okay, there's one more in the chat. Molly said, can I just check? You said the term asylum seekers in your study refers only to those who are unsuccessful, not those whose cases were pending.
So unsuccessful during the time that I was doing this study. No, some of them were pending. Yes, like a proportion of them, but 3,500 of them were probably pending. Most probably pending. So that that question is interesting because I looked at those whose asylum seeker first decision for asylum seeker is approved. So means that their case is being considered. But for these people, if they don't, it could take quite a few years. And if they don't receive a convention, if their case is not approved, they don't get a convention, then that means that they have to redo their visa every year to that point. And that renewal of the visa could be under different names, you know. And from looking at administrative data, I can't say whether they just gave up, you know, an asylum seeking, or I just know that they applied for asylum seeking at some point and they didn't become refugees. So that's the case, you know. It's a very difficult, it was a very difficult group. And I looked at the last substream, last decision, and it was just a lot of definitions, a lot of things written there. And I've talked to quite a few people in the sector. We are still consulting people to understand who these people are, and yeah, for a proportion of them, definitely their case is pending.
Were there any other questions for Arezoo or Annie? All right, if not, thank you both so much for sharing your research with us. It was really interesting. And I'm sure people can email you as well if they've got any further questions.